The internet didn't wake up angry that morning. It woke up confused. One sentence, one interview clip, one explosive claim framed just vaguely enough to sound real. And suddenly everyone was asking the same forbidden question at the same time. What if the most shocking rumor about the royal family wasn't leaked by a palace insider, but by a sister? Pause for a second and think about that. Not a journalist, not a court document, not a doctor, a family member, and not just any family member, but the one the world has been told to ignore for years. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Before we go any further, let me ask you something directly. Why do some stories feel radioactive the moment they appear? Why do certain claims spread faster than facts ever could? And why, once they're out there, do they refuse to die? Because what exploded across social media wasn't just gossip. It wasn't just another headline. It was something far more powerful. It was the suggestion of proof. And that's where this story begins. Late one night, as timelines refreshed and comment sections refreshed even faster, a name resurfaced that always seems to bring chaos with it: Samantha Markle. For years, she'd existed on the fringes of the Meghan narrative. Dismissed, debated, mocked, occasionally amplified, then quietly set aside again. Until this time. Because this time, she didn't just talk. She hinted. She didn't accuse directly. She implied. She didn't offer conclusions. She gestured towards something much more dangerous: documentation. And the moment that word entered the conversation, everything changed. Records. Let that word sit for a moment. Records sound official. Records sound final. Records sound like truth, even when they aren't. And suddenly, the internet did what it always does when it smells blood in the water. It filled in the blanks. Some people leaned forward, hungry. Others recoiled, uncomfortable but unable to look away. And a third group asked the question no one wanted to answer out loud. What if this time, there's something there? But here's the part that rarely gets discussed. Nothing had actually been shown. No verified documents were released. No medical authority confirmed anything. No legal filing appeared. And yet, belief was already spreading faster than any evidence ever could. Why? Because the claim wasn't just about information. It was about identity. At the center of the storm stood Meghan Markle, a woman whose public life has been shaped as much by rumor as by reality. Think about the narrative weight that name already carries. Every gesture scrutinized, every silence interpreted, every personal detail debated by strangers who have never met her. So when a family member steps forward and even hints at something deeply personal, the ground shifts instantly. This wasn't about royal drama anymore. This wasn't about interviews or Netflix specials or tabloid feuds. This touched something far more sensitive: health, privacy, womanhood, motherhood. And that's why this story matters now. Because we're living in a moment where suggestion often outweighs verification. Where being first matters more than being right. Where the phrase allegedly is enough to ignite a firestorm. Let me ask you something else. Have you noticed how quickly the conversation moved from what was claimed to what was assumed? One moment, people were asking, did she really say that? The next, they were declaring, this explains everything. Explains what exactly? That's the danger. When claims are vague, audiences fill in the gaps with their own biases. When proof is absent, imagination rushes in to compensate. And the internet is very, very good at imagination. Within hours, reaction videos appeared. Threads dissected facial expressions. Old interviews were replayed with new interpretations layered on top. Everything became retroactive evidence. A pause meant something. A smile meant something. A silence meant everything. But let's slow this down. Because buried beneath the noise is a deeper question, one that rarely gets asked when scandals break. Why do we want this to be true? Not why we believe it. Why we want it. Is it because controversy feels validating? Because it confirms narratives we've already chosen sides on? Because it gives us a sense of insider knowledge? Or is it something darker? There's a reason health-related rumors hit harder than financial scandals or leaked emails. They feel intimate. They feel invasive. They feel final. Once whispered, they stick. And even when debunked, they leave residue. That's why ethical journalism treats medical claims with extreme caution. And that's why social media doesn't. Because outrage spreads faster than restraint. Let's talk about Samantha for a moment. Not as a villain, not as a hero, but as a catalyst. For years, she's existed in a strange limbo, too connected to ignore, too controversial to trust. Her statements are often framed as bitterness by some, bravery by others. And that split matters. Because when someone already exists in a polarized space, every word they say is amplified in two directions at once. To one side, she's finally telling the truth. To the other, she's desperate for relevance. And to the algorithm, she's content. Which brings us to the real engine behind this explosion. Attention. The modern media economy doesn't reward certainty. It rewards engagement. Questions get clicks. Implications get shares. Outrage gets monetized. And nothing generates outrage like the suggestion that someone has been hiding something deeply personal from the world. Especially a woman. Especially a public figure. Especially one people already love to argue about. So ask yourself this. If no verified documents were released, if no medical authority confirmed anything, if everything rests on implication and reaction, why does it already feel settled in some corners of the internet? Because repetition creates reality. Once a claim is echoed enough times, it stops sounding like speculation and starts sounding like history. And that's the most dangerous transformation of all. This is how rumors become footnotes, how whispers become headlines, how I heard becomes everyone knows. And this story is still in that fragile early stage, where it could either collapse under scrutiny or calcify into permanent myth. What makes this even more volatile is the silence on the other side. No immediate response, no press release, no denial splashed across the front page. And silence, in the age of instant commentary, is never neutral. Some see it as dignity. Others see it as confirmation. But silence doesn't stop speculation. It feeds it. Because into that quiet space, the internet pours its loudest theories. And that's where we are right now. At the edge of a story that hasn't fully formed, but already feels irreversible. A sister making a claim without showing proof. A public figure choosing not to respond. An audience deciding what it believes before the facts catch up. So before we move forward, hold on to this question. In a world addicted to leaks, screenshots, and receipts, what happens when the most powerful weapon is simply the suggestion that evidence exists? Because what came next wasn't louder accusations. It was something far more unsettling. The internet didn't wait for proof. It moved on without it. And that decision would change everything, in ways no one saw coming. But here's the question no one slowed down long enough to ask. Why now? If this was truly explosive information, if it was something so shocking it could change everything, why did it surface this way? Not through a court filing, not through an investigative report, not through a verified release, but through implication, through tone, through pauses, through the careful use of a single word designed to do all the heavy lifting. Records. So let's rewind, because to understand why the internet ran with this so fast, you have to understand the person at the center of the spark. Not the headline, not the rumor, but the sister the world has learned to tune out and then suddenly can't ignore. Who is Samantha Markle when the cameras are off? For most people, family disputes are private, messy, emotional, unresolved, but contained. For the Markles, nothing has ever stayed contained. For years, Samantha Markle has existed in a strange public shadow, close enough to the story to feel relevant, distant enough to be questioned at every turn. She's been described as bitter. She's been described as brave. She's been described as unreliable. She's been described as the only one telling the truth. Notice something? Those labels depend entirely on who's listening. And that's not accidental. From the very beginning of Meghan's rise into global fame, Samantha positioned herself not just as a sibling, but as a counter-narrative. Where Meghan projected polish, Samantha emphasized resentment. Where Meghan spoke about reinvention, Samantha spoke about abandonment. Two sisters, two versions of the same family story, and the world forced to choose which one felt more believable. But belief is rarely about facts. It's about emotion. Samantha didn't become relevant because she was proven right. She became relevant because she was persistent. Interview after interview, statement after statement, always circling the same themes: betrayal, lies, hidden truths. Most of the time, the reaction followed a predictable pattern: outrage, debate, then fatigue. People stopped listening. Until this moment. Because this time, the framing was different. This time, it wasn't just my sister did this, or my sister said that. This time, the suggestion was that there was something official, something documented, something that existed beyond memory and emotion. And that distinction matters more than people realize. Let me ask you something directly. If someone you barely trust tells you a story, you hesitate. But if they tell you they have paperwork, your brain shifts gears. You lean in. That's exactly what happened here. Samantha didn't need to show anything. She didn't need to publish anything. She only needed to let the idea of documentation hang in the air long enough for others to do the work for her. And they did. Clips were replayed endlessly. Her wording was dissected frame by frame. Every hesitation became intentional. Every emphasis became evidence. People started asking not, is this true? But why hasn't this been addressed? That's a dangerous pivot. Because once the burden shifts from proving a claim to explaining a silence, the damage is already done. And let's be honest, Samantha knows the media ecosystem she's operating in. She knows outrage drives clicks. She knows controversy keeps microphones open. She knows that ambiguity protects her from accountability while still maximizing impact. This wasn't a legal move. It was a narrative move. And narrative moves don't need proof. They need timing. So why now? Think about the broader context. Public patience is thin. Trust in institutions is eroding. Audiences are trained to believe that the truth is always being hidden from them. And Meghan Markle, whether fairly or not, has been positioned for years as someone with something to hide. That's not an accusation. That's an observation of how she's been framed. Every silence becomes strategic. Every statement becomes calculated. Every boundary becomes suspicious. So when a family member hints at something deeply personal, the audience doesn't ask whether it should be discussed. They ask why it hasn't been discussed already. That's how narrative traps work. And Samantha walked straight into the center of one, or maybe built it herself. But here's where things get more complicated. Because Samantha isn't just a rogue voice shouting into the void. She's been platformed. Talk shows, interviews, headlines that frame her not as a fringe figure, but as an insider. Each appearance reinforces the same idea. She's connected enough to know something. And connection, in the public imagination, often substitutes for credibility. Ask yourself this. If a stranger made the same claims, would anyone care? Probably not. But a sister? That changes the emotional calculus completely. Family members are assumed to know things others don't. They're assumed to have access. They're assumed to be witnesses, even when those assumptions aren't backed by evidence. And that's why this chapter of the story feels different from all the others. It's not louder. It's not more detailed. It's simply framed in a way that bypasses skepticism. But framing is not truth. And that's where the contradiction sits, right at the heart of this firestorm. Samantha wants to be seen as a truth teller. But truth tellers usually show their work. Here, the work is implied, not presented. So why does that implication feel so powerful? Because we've been trained to believe that anything not denied immediately must be true. And that's unfair. Dangerously unfair. Silence can mean many things. Legal advice, personal boundaries, a refusal to dignify speculation. But in the age of instant reaction, silence is often interpreted as guilt by default. Which brings us back to the other figure at the center of this storm, Meghan Markle. Meghan has spent years being accused of controlling her narrative. Too polished, too media savvy, too careful. And now, that same caution is being used against her. If she responds, she amplifies the rumor. If she doesn't, she's accused of hiding something. It's a no-win situation. And Samantha knows that. This isn't about forcing a response. It's about creating a narrative that thrives regardless of one. But here's the part that rarely gets said out loud. Family dynamics don't exist in a vacuum. Resentment builds. Stories calcify. Memories get reshaped by emotion. Just because someone believes something doesn't mean it's true. And just because something is said publicly doesn't make it factual. But the internet doesn't reward nuance. It rewards certainty. And Samantha's statements, however vague, were delivered with certainty. That's what gave them weight. That's what made people stop scrolling. That's what turned a suggestion into a global conversation. And yet, beneath all of this noise, there's an uncomfortable truth we have to confront. We don't actually know what motivated this moment. Was it revenge? Was it relevance? Was it a genuine belief that she was correcting the record? Or was it something far more ordinary? Unresolved pain playing out on the largest stage possible? The answer matters less than the effect, because the effect is already irreversible. Once a claim like this enters the public bloodstream, it doesn't disappear. It mutates. It adapts. It gets repeated without context. And every repetition strips away more doubt. So where does that leave us? With a sister who refuses to go away, a public figure who refuses to engage, and an audience caught between curiosity and discomfort. And we're only at the beginning. Because the next phase of this story doesn't involve Samantha speaking again. It involves something far more powerful. The internet deciding it already knows the truth and rewriting the past to match it. And once that starts, there's no undoing it. Oh, here's the uncomfortable turn the story took next. The conversation stopped being about what was said and started being about what people felt must be true. That's the moment everything tilted. Because once the internet decides it's done waiting, facts become optional. Let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how the word proof doesn't actually require proof anymore? How just the promise of it is enough? That's what happened here. No documents were published. No files were authenticated. No experts weighed in. And yet, timelines filled with confident declarations. This explains it. I always suspected something. Now it all makes sense. Makes sense how? That's the question no one could answer clearly, but they didn't need to. Because clarity was replaced by consensus. And consensus is powerful. This is where rumor culture becomes something far more dangerous. Because at this stage, the story no longer belongs to the person who made the claim. It belongs to the audience. And audiences don't investigate. They connect dots, whether those dots belong together or not. Think about how fast the pivot happened. First, people asked, did she really say she had records? Then it became, why hasn't anyone denied it? Then suddenly, if it wasn't true, it would have been shut down by now. That leap is everything. That leap is where speculation hardens into belief. And belief doesn't care whether it's fair. It only cares whether it feels right. Now let's talk about the illusion of evidence. Because something fascinating happened in the hours that followed. Old interviews resurfaced. Photos were reanalyzed. Statements from years ago were replayed with new captions. Nothing new was discovered. But everything was reinterpreted. A pause from years ago suddenly became suspicious. A joke became a signal. A vague comment became foreshadowing. This is how narratives rewrite history in real time. The human brain hates uncertainty. It craves patterns. So when someone suggests a hidden truth exists, the brain goes hunting for confirmation. And the internet provides endless material for that hunt. Every clip becomes a clue. Every silence becomes suspicious. Every denial becomes too defensive. It's a trap. And once you fall into it, there's no neutral position left. You're either awake or you're in denial. That binary framing is incredibly effective because it turns curiosity into moral positioning. If you question the claim, you're accused of protecting power. If you believe it, you're applauded for seeing through the lies. There's no reward for restraint. Let's pause here and ask a harder question. Why are medical rumors so irresistible? Out of all the things someone could accuse a public figure of, money, fame, manipulation, why does health speculation hit harder? Because it feels intimate. It feels forbidden. It feels like crossing a boundary we all know exists, but secretly want to peek over. Health isn't just information. It's identity. And when people speculate about it, they aren't just talking about facts. They're reshaping how someone is perceived at the most personal level. That's why these rumors linger longer than financial scandals. That's why they don't fade when the news cycle moves on. They sink in. And the internet doesn't treat health claims with caution. It treats them like puzzles to be solved. And puzzles are addictive. But here's the contradiction no one wants to acknowledge. The same people demanding transparency are the same people outraged when boundaries are crossed. They say, we deserve answers. Then say, why is nothing private anymore? You can't have both. Yet the outrage machine depends on pretending you can. At this stage, the story had evolved into something else entirely. It wasn't about whether the claim was true. It was about whether the silence was acceptable. And silence, in the current media environment, is almost always framed as an admission. But silence can be strategic. It can be protective. It can be legal. It can be human. Responding to a rumor like this risks legitimizing it. Ignoring it risks allowing it to spread unchecked. That's the impossible bind. And the internet knows it. Which is why it no longer matters what was meant. It only matters what was heard. And what was heard was explosive. But the most ironic part? The louder the speculation got, the less substance there actually was. No new information emerged. No additional evidence appeared. No verification followed. Just more noise. More certainty. More outrage. More confidence without content. And yet, something else happened quietly in the background. A shift. Some people began to feel uncomfortable. They didn't comment. They didn't share. They just watched. Because even in outrage culture, there's a line. And for some, this story crossed it. Health speculation isn't like other gossip. It doesn't feel harmless. It doesn't feel funny. It feels invasive. And that discomfort matters, because it signals the next phase of the story. Backlash. Not against the claim itself, but against the culture that consumed it so eagerly. Questions started to appear, not shouted, but whispered. Should we even be talking about this? Is this crossing a line? What if none of this is true? Those questions didn't trend, but they didn't disappear either. They lingered, and they set the stage for what came next. Because once discomfort enters the conversation, the narrative doesn't just grow louder, it fractures. And when a story fractures, it creates sides. Believers, skeptics, and a silent middle unsure what to think. That tension was building, and it was about to explode. Because the next chapter of this story wasn't driven by speculation anymore. It was driven by reaction, media reaction, public reaction, and the consequences of letting a rumor grow unchecked. And when that reaction hit, it exposed something far more unsettling than the original claim. It revealed how easily a suggestion can turn into a verdict. And what came next would force everyone watching to confront a question they'd been avoiding from the start. Not is this true? But what if we were never supposed to decide? So what happens when a rumor grows so large that even the people spreading it start to feel uneasy? That's the moment the story changes shape. Because once discomfort enters the room, the narrative can no longer pretend it's just curiosity. It becomes confrontation. And that's exactly where this went next. The first cracks didn't come from official statements or legal threats. They came from tone. Suddenly, the headlines shifted. Not louder. Sharper. Not bolder. More careful. Phrases like alleged, unverified, and claims without evidence began to appear, not in the spotlight, but buried deep in the fine print. Why? Because media outlets realized something too late. They had helped light a fire they couldn't control. Let's talk about media reaction, not what was said publicly, but what changed behind the scenes. When a story like this breaks, editors ask 3 questions immediately. Is it clickable? Is it defensible? Is it sustainable? At first, the answer to all 3 felt like yes. It was explosive. It involved a polarizing public figure. It generated engagement. But sustainability is where things fell apart. Because the longer the story ran, the more obvious the absence became. No documents. No corroboration. No escalation from credible sources. Just repetition. And repetition without progression is a red flag in journalism. It means the story isn't evolving, it's echoing. That's when outlets start to worry. Not about truth, about liability. Medical claims are different from other rumors. They aren't just reputational. They're legal landmines. And suddenly, the enthusiasm cooled. Segments that were once framed as breaking became discussion. Certainty softened into speculation. Bold headlines quietly disappeared from homepages. But here's the important part. The internet didn't slow down just because the media did. In fact, the pullback created another narrative entirely. Cover up. You've seen this pattern before. When attention fades, some audiences don't interpret it as caution. They interpret it as suppression. Why did they stop talking about it? Who shut this down? Someone must have made a call. The absence of noise became proof of influence. Which is ironic, because the slowdown was driven by doubt, not confirmation. But doubt doesn't trend. Suspicion does. So the story split in 2 directions at once. On one side, mainstream media grew quieter, more careful, more conditional. On the other, online communities grew louder, more convinced, more absolute. 2 parallel realities. And in between them sat a public figure who still hadn't said a word. Let's talk about that silence again, because this is where it takes on a new meaning. At first, silence was interpreted as avoidance. Now, it started to look strategic. Because the more chaotic the conversation became, the clearer one thing grew. Engaging would not stop this. It would fuel it. Think about it. What could possibly be said that wouldn't escalate the situation? A denial would be dissected. A clarification would be misquoted. A boundary would be reframed as deflection. There is no clean response to an unverified health claim. And that's the trap. The moment someone suggests deeply personal information exists, the accused loses control of the frame. They can only react, and reaction is exactly what rumor culture feeds on. So silence wasn't weakness. It was containment. But containment has a cost. Because while silence can protect legally, it leaves an emotional vacuum. And into that vacuum, people project whatever they want. That's when something else started to happen. The story stopped being about Samantha. Her name appeared less. Her voice faded. The claim had outgrown its source. And that's when things get dangerous. Because once a rumor detaches from the person who introduced it, it becomes myth. And myths don't need authors. They sustain themselves. People began referring to the story without naming who started it. They spoke in absolutes, as if it were common knowledge. Everyone knows. It's been confirmed. It was leaked. Leaked by whom? No one could say. That's when you know a narrative has crossed the line from allegation to folklore. And folklore is immune to correction. At this stage, even people who doubted the story felt pressure to hedge. Not this is false, but if it were true, that conditional framing matters. Because it keeps the idea alive. It allows speculation to continue without accountability. And that's exactly what happened next. Influencers pivoted. They stopped stating claims outright. They started asking leading questions. What if this explains? Could this be why? Is this the missing piece? Questions feel safer than accusations. But they do the same damage. Because they guide the audience toward a conclusion without ever stating it. That's how rumors evolve to survive scrutiny. They become hypotheticals. And hypotheticals can't be disproven. But something else was shifting quietly beneath the surface. Fatigue. Outrage has a shelf life. The same audiences that once devoured every update began to feel uneasy. Not bored, uneasy. Because even for people who dislike a public figure, there's a threshold where entertainment starts to feel cruel. Health speculation crosses that threshold for many. And when enough people feel that discomfort, a backlash begins to form. Not loud at first. Subtle. Side comments. Longer pauses before sharing. Creators disabling comments entirely. You might not notice it immediately, but it's there. The energy changes. Instead of excitement, there's defensiveness. Instead of curiosity, there's justification. That's just my opinion. I'm just asking questions. I didn't say it was true. Those disclaimers are a tell. They signal that people know, on some level, that something is off. And that's when the moral tension enters the story. Because once people realize they might be participating in harm, they have two choices. Pull back, or double down. And doubling down is often easier. It allows people to avoid self-reflection. It turns criticism into persecution. If you question this story, you're silencing victims. If you ask for proof, you're protecting power. That framing shuts down dialogue. It replaces ethics with allegiance. And allegiance doesn't care about nuance. So the camps hardened. Believers became more confident. Skeptics became more vocal. And the silent middle retreated entirely, which leaves a distorted perception. Because the loudest voices don't represent the majority. They represent the most motivated. And motivation in outrage culture is often driven by emotion, not evidence. At this point, the story wasn't just about a rumor. It was about who people chose to trust. A sister who speaks loudly and emotionally, or a public figure who says nothing at all. People rarely choose silence. Silence feels distant. Emotion feels authentic, even when it isn't accurate. That's why this moment matters. Because it exposes something uncomfortable about how we consume stories. We say we want facts, but we respond to feelings. We say we value privacy, but we reward invasion. We say we're skeptical, but we believe what aligns with our existing views. And this story sits right at the intersection of all of that. Now here's where the stakes quietly escalated. Legal implications. Not lawsuits. Not threats. Just awareness. Once a rumor crosses into medical territory, the consequences multiply. Defamation law. Privacy law. Platform responsibility. Suddenly, people realized this wasn't just gossip anymore. It was potentially actionable. That realization didn't stop the conversation, but it did change how it was framed. Creators became more careful with language. Outlets added more disclaimers. Segments were re-edited after posting. That's never a good sign for a story's credibility. It signals uncertainty, and uncertainty breeds suspicion. Which brings us to the most unsettling part of this phase. Even if the rumor were completely false, the damage was already done, because the idea had lodged itself in public consciousness. And once an idea like that takes hold, it becomes impossible to fully erase. Search results don't forget. Archives don't expire. Clips don't disappear. Years from now, someone will stumble across this story without context. They won't see the uncertainty. They won't see the doubt. They'll just see the claim. And that's how reputations are permanently altered, not by verdicts, but by accumulation. This is the hidden cost of outrage culture. It doesn't need to be right. It just needs to be loud long enough. And that's what made this moment so pivotal. Because for the first time, people started asking a different question. Not is this true, but should this have been a story at all? That question changes everything. Because once it's asked, the audience is forced to confront its own role. And that's uncomfortable. Much more uncomfortable than choosing sides. So here we are. A rumor introduced through implication, amplified through speculation, questioned through discomfort, and now approaching a reckoning. Because the next phase of this story doesn't involve claims or silence. It involves consequences, not legal ones, not official ones, cultural ones. The consequences of what happens when millions of people feel entitled to answers they were never owed. And when those consequences hit, they didn't land where anyone expected. Because the backlash wasn't aimed at the rumor. It was aimed at the people who believed it. And what came next exposed something far more revealing than any alleged document ever could. It revealed how quickly empathy disappears when outrage feels more satisfying. And once that realization surfaced, the entire narrative began to collapse in on itself. And that collapse didn't happen with a bang. It happened with a pause. A long, uncomfortable pause where people realized the story had gone somewhere it was never meant to go. Because the backlash that followed wasn't loud at first. It wasn't trending. It didn't come with hashtags. It crept in sideways. Comments quietly disappeared. Creators softened their language. Some videos were taken down without explanation. And that silence? It felt different from the one before. This wasn't strategic quiet. This was unease. So let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how quickly confidence evaporates once people sense they might be on the wrong side of history? That's what happened here. The energy shifted from certainty to defensiveness. Suddenly, the same voices that had spoken in absolutes began adding qualifiers. I never said it was true. I was just reporting what was out there. I'm asking questions. Those phrases are tells. They signal retreat. Because the moment the conversation turned from speculation to ethics, many realized they didn't like the role they were playing. This is the phase no one prepares for. The mirror phase, where the story stops being about the public figure and starts being about us. And that's uncomfortable, because it forces a reckoning with motive. Why were we so eager to believe this? Why did we spread it so confidently? Why did we feel entitled to answers about something so personal? There's a reason backlash often targets audiences and creators rather than the original claim. Because once the claim is out there, it's already done its damage. But participation? Participation is a choice. And when people began to reflect on that choice, the tone changed dramatically. Let's talk about the creators who built entire narratives around implication. They didn't get sued. They didn't get censored. They got questioned. Comments asking, where's the proof? Emails from viewers saying, this feels wrong. Private messages urging them to reconsider. And those messages matter. Because outrage culture thrives on the illusion of consensus. Once that illusion cracks, everything else follows. Some creators doubled down. They framed the pushback as censorship. They accused critics of trying to silence truth. But others paused. They rewatched their own content. They reread their scripts. They rewatch their own content. They reread their scripts. And something didn't sit right anymore. Because beneath the speculation, beneath the clicks, beneath the performance, there was a person, and that realization hit harder than any debunking ever could. This is where the narrative took a sharp turn. Not because of new information, but because of moral fatigue. People got tired of being angry, tired of justifying cruelty as curiosity. tired of pretending this was about accountability rather than appetite. And once fatigue sets in, outrage loses its grip. But there was still one unresolved tension hanging in the air. The sister. Where did Samantha fit into this phase? Interestingly, she became quieter. Not silent, but less present. Fewer appearances, less amplification. Because when a story turns inward and begins questioning the ethics of its own existence, the original source often fades into the background. It's no longer about what was said. It's about what was done with it. And that distinction is critical. At this point, Samantha's role had already been absorbed into the larger myth. She wasn't the story anymore. The culture was, which raises a deeper, more unsettling question. What responsibility does someone have when they introduce an idea that can't be contained? Is intent enough? Or does outcome matter more? Because regardless of motive, the result was undeniable. A deeply personal topic had been turned into public entertainment. And once that line is crossed, there's no clean way back. Let's talk about empathy for a moment. Not the performative kind, but the quiet kind that shows up late. Empathy doesn't trend. It doesn't go viral. It arrives after the damage is done. And when it arrived here, it didn't look like apologies. It looked like hesitation. People stopped sharing, stopped speculating, stopped filling in the blanks. Not because they suddenly believed the rumor was false, but because they realized believing it felt wrong. That's a subtle but powerful shift. It means the story lost its emotional fuel. And without fuel, outrage sputters. But the consequences didn't disappear. They lingered. Search results still surfaced old clips. Comments still existed. Assumptions still floated around. This is the tragedy of modern rumor cycles. Even when people move on, the residue remains. And that residue shapes perception long after the moment has passed. Now let's confront something that often gets ignored in stories like this. Silence, in the long run, often wins. Not in the moment, not emotionally, but historically. Because while rumors flare and fade, records of restraint age better than screenshots of speculation. That doesn't mean silence is easy. It means it's costly in a different way. It requires enduring misinterpretation, enduring frustration, enduring the urge to correct the record. But it also prevents escalation. And escalation is exactly what this story never got. Despite how explosive it felt, there was no follow-up reveal, no second wave of proof, no dramatic confirmation, just a slow, awkward realization that the story had outrun itself. That's when the collapse truly set in. Not with a denial, not with a lawsuit, with absence. The absence of anything new. And absence is fatal to outrage, because outrage needs novelty to survive. When days passed without updates, attention drifted. New scandals emerged. New targets appeared. And just like that, the internet moved on. But moving on doesn't mean resolving. It means burying. And buried stories don't disappear, they wait. They resurface years later in comment sections, in compilation videos, in whispered, remember when conversations. Stripped of nuance, stripped of doubt, just floating fragments. That's the real danger. Not the initial rumor, but the long-term distortion. Now here's the part that complicates everything. Even as the story faded, the underlying dynamics remained unchanged. We still reward implication over evidence. We still confuse curiosity with entitlement. We still mistake silence for guilt. Which means this wasn't an anomaly. It was a rehearsal. A preview of how easily deeply personal boundaries can be crossed when the right emotional triggers are pulled. And that's the lesson no one wanted to sit with. Because it implicates everyone. The creator chasing clicks. The viewer chasing dopamine. The platform chasing engagement. No villains. Just incentives. So where does that leave us? With a story that began as a suggestion, grew into a spectacle, fractured under scrutiny, and quietly collapsed under the weight of its own discomfort. But something important happened in that collapse. A question surfaced that refused to go away. Not is this true? Not who started it? But what do we owe each other? What do we owe public figures when it comes to privacy? What do we owe audiences when it comes to accuracy? What do we owe ourselves when it comes to restraint? Those questions don't trend, but they linger, and they set the stage for what comes next. Because while this chapter of the story faded from headlines, it left behind a blueprint. A blueprint for how rumors are born, how they spread, how they collapse, and how they scar. And the final phase of this story doesn't involve Samantha. It doesn't involve Meghan. It involves something much closer to home. The realization that the next time a rumor like this appears, we'll face the same choice again. Lean in, or step back. Believe, or wait. Part. If this story had never involved a famous name, if it had been about an ordinary person, would it have lasted more than a day? Probably not. Which tells us something critical. The fuel wasn't the claim. It was the platform. Fame turns implication into spectacle. And once spectacle enters the room, restraint leaves. This is where we have to zoom out. Because what happened here wasn't unique. It was familiar. We've seen this cycle before. A suggestion drops. It's vague enough to avoid accountability, emotional enough to invite interpretation, and controversial enough to demand attention. The internet reacts. Media amplifies. Audiences polarize. Then the story collapses under its own contradictions, not because it's disproven, but because it exhausts itself. And the next one takes its place. But here's what makes this case different. This one crossed a boundary that most scandals avoid. It didn't just speculate about actions. It speculated about the body. And once the body becomes content, there is no neutral ground left. That's why this moment lingered longer than it should have. Because it triggered something primal. Curiosity mixed with judgment. Empathy mixed with entitlement. People weren't just asking, what happened? They were asking, what does this mean about her? And that question is loaded. Because it turns private biology into public character assessment. It reframes identity. And once identity is reframed publicly, correction becomes nearly impossible. Let's talk about narrative inheritance. Every public figure inherits a story the moment they enter the spotlight. Some parts they control. Some parts they fight. Some parts they're stuck with forever. In this case, the rumor attempted to graft itself onto an existing narrative, not as a standalone claim, but as an explanation. This is why. This explains everything. This makes sense now. That's the most dangerous kind of rumor. The kind that pretends to resolve ambiguity. Because ambiguity makes people uncomfortable. And stories that promise resolution, even false ones, feel satisfying. But satisfaction doesn't equal truth. It equals closure. And closure is addictive. Now let's talk about something that doesn't get discussed enough. The illusion of accountability. Many people justified engaging with this story by framing it as accountability. She's a public figure. She put her life out there. Transparency comes with the territory. But accountability requires evidence. It requires proportionality. It requires relevance. This had none of those things. What it had was access. Access to attention. Access to platforms. Access to an audience trained to conflate curiosity with moral duty. That's not accountability. That's consumption. And once you see it that way, the entire story reframes itself. Because consumption doesn't ask whether something should be shared. It only asks whether it can be. This is where the discomfort really sets in. Because if this rumor was wrong, and we still don't know, then countless people participated in amplifying a deeply invasive falsehood. And if it was somehow partially true, which still remains unproven, then countless people participated in violating a boundary that should never have been crossed publicly. Either way, there's no clean moral victory. That's the trap. The story was structured so that engagement itself caused harm, regardless of outcome. And that's not accidental. It's a feature of outrage economics. Now let's look at what didn't happen, because absence is as revealing as presence. There was no authoritative confirmation, no reputable investigation, no credible follow-up. No one stepped forward to say, here is the truth. And yet, many people walked away feeling like they knew something. That's the power of narrative framing. It creates the illusion of knowledge without delivering information. And that illusion is enough for most audiences. Because knowing feels good, especially when it feels forbidden. But here's the part that deserves real attention. The story didn't end because it was resolved. It ended because it became inconvenient. Inconvenient to defend. Inconvenient to justify. Inconvenient to keep explaining without sounding cruel. And inconvenience is the quiet killer of internet outrage. People don't stop believing. They stop talking. And silence, once again, becomes the final chapter. But this time, it isn't protective silence. It's avoidance. Because no one wants to be left holding a story that crossed a line. So the narrative gets abandoned. No closure. No reckoning. Just a slow drift into the background noise of the internet. And that drift is dangerous. because it allows the story to survive in fragments. Half-remembered, contextless, stripped of uncertainty. Years from now, someone will reference it casually. I heard something about that once. Wasn't there a rumor? I think it was confirmed. Confirmed by whom? No one will know. And that's how myths are born. Not through proof, through repetition. This is why moments like this matter far beyond the individuals involved. They reveal how easily a society can normalize invasion when curiosity is framed as righteousness. They reveal how quickly empathy erodes when someone becomes a symbol rather than a person. And they reveal how rarely we stop to ask whether engagement itself is the harm. So let's bring this back to you, the viewer, the listener, the participant. Because this isn't just a story about what happened. It's a story about what happens next time. And there will be a next time. Another rumor. Another implication. Another leak. And when it arrives, it will follow the same playbook. Vague claim. Emotional delivery. Silence on the other side. And the same question will be placed in front of you. Do you lean in? Or do you pause? Do you share? Or do you wait? Do you treat it as entertainment? Or as someone's life? Those decisions feel small in the moment. But collectively, they shape culture. And culture determines what becomes acceptable. This story tested that boundary. And the result wasn't flattering. But here's the twist. Even in this mess, something shifted. Some people noticed. Some people questioned. Some people stepped back. And that matters. Because cultural change doesn't start with outrage. It starts with discomfort. The quiet kind. The kind that makes you hesitate before clicking share. The kind that makes you ask, why am I watching this? And that hesitation is where the real ending begins. Because the final chapter of this story isn't about a claim or a rebuttal. It's about a realization. A realization that the most powerful choice in outrage culture isn't believing or disbelieving. It's refusing to participate. And when that realization fully sinks in, the entire machinery starts to wobble. Because outrage only works when we feed it. And the moment we stop feeding it, the system changes. But that realization doesn't come easily. It arrives slowly, unevenly, and often too late. Which brings us to the final question this story leaves hanging in the air. If we know how damaging this cycle can be, if we've seen the harm it causes, if we've felt the discomfort it leaves behind, why do we keep falling for it? And more importantly, what will it take to finally break the pattern? Because the next time a story like this surfaces, and it will, the answer to that question will decide whether we repeat the same mistake or finally choose a different ending. So this is where we slow down. Not because the story ran out of energy, but because it ran out of excuses. Because by the time everything faded, by the time the outrage cycle moved on and the algorithms found a new obsession, one thing was undeniable. Nothing concrete had ever emerged. No documents. No confirmations. No definitive truth. Just noise. And that's the most unsettling ending of all. Because stories usually end with answers. This one ended with a realization. That the damage didn't come from what was proven. It came from what was assumed. Let's go back to the very beginning for a moment. Remember the hook. The suggestion that something shocking existed. The implication that answers were being hidden. The idea that the public was being denied the truth. That framing was powerful because it tapped into something deeply human. We hate uncertainty. Uncertainty makes us feel small, out of control, excluded. And when someone dangles the promise of clarity, especially clarity about someone powerful, it feels irresistible. But clarity without evidence isn't truth. It's comfort. And comfort can be dangerous when it replaces critical thinking. That's what this story ultimately exposed. Not secrets, not proof, but appetite. The appetite for explanation, for resolution, for narratives that make complicated people easier to categorize. Villain, victim, liar, truth teller. Those labels feel satisfying. They let us stop thinking. But real life doesn't work that way. Real life is messy, contradictory, often unresolved. And the internet hates unresolved stories. So it resolves them artificially, by filling in gaps, by repeating speculation until it sounds like fact, by confusing familiarity with confirmation. That's what happened here. And it happened fast. Now let's talk about the cost, not in abstract terms, but in real ones. When rumors like this spread, they don't just affect the person at the center. They affect families, children, extended relationships, future narratives. They shape how someone is seen long after the moment passes. Even if the rumor fades, the shadow remains. And here's the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. Once you participate in spreading a story like this, you don't get to decide how it's remembered. You don't get to say, "That's not what I meant." You don't get to control how it's interpreted later. You contribute to a permanent archive. Screenshots don't forget. Search engines don't contextualize. Future audiences don't know what doubts existed at the time. They only see the claim. That's why participation matters. Not because every share is malicious, but because every share has consequences. Now, some people will argue this comes with the territory of fame, that public figures give up their right to privacy. But that argument has limits. Being public doesn't mean being property. Visibility isn't consent. And health, identity, and the body are not fair game simply because someone is recognizable. Once we accept that anything is acceptable as long as it involves a famous name, we erase the line entirely. And when that line disappears, no one is safe. Not public figures. Not private citizens who go viral overnight. Not families dragged into stories they never asked to be part of. This story is a warning, not about a person, but about a system. A system that rewards speed over accuracy, emotion over evidence, engagement over empathy. And here's the hardest part to sit with. That system only works because we participate in it. Creators respond to incentives. Platforms amplify what performs. Audiences reward what makes them feel something. Outrage performs. Nuance does not. So every time we click, share, comment, or speculate, we reinforce the same pattern. And that's why this story doesn't really end here. It pauses, waiting to repeat itself, because there will be another rumor, another implication, another leak. And when it arrives, it will feel familiar. The same rush, the same certainty, the same confidence that this time, it must be true. And in that moment, you'll have a choice. Not a dramatic one, a quiet one. Do you lean forward, or do you lean back? Do you treat the story as entertainment, or as someone's life? Do you share because it feels satisfying, or pause because it feels invasive? Those decisions don't trend. They don't get likes. But collectively, they decide what kind of culture we live in. This story showed us how quickly empathy can be overridden when curiosity is framed as righteousness. It showed us how silence can be weaponized, not because it proves guilt, but because we've trained ourselves to distrust restraint. It showed us how rumors don't need to be proven to be effective. They only need to feel plausible. And perhaps most importantly, it showed us how rarely we stop to ask a simple question before engaging. Should this be mine to consume? That question changes everything. Because the moment you ask it, the spell breaks. The outrage loses its grip. The narrative slows down. The humanity returns. And that's where the real power lies. Not in exposing others, but in choosing how we respond. So as this chapter closes, don't think of it as an ending. Think of it as a mirror, a reflection of how stories are built, how easily lines are crossed, and how quickly we forget the people behind the headlines. Because the next time a story like this appears, and it will, you'll recognize the pattern immediately. The implication, the silence, the rush to decide. And when that moment comes, the real question won't be whether the rumor is true. It will be whether we've learned anything at all. And that answer? That one is still unwritten. And yet, even after all of that reflection, even after the pause, the discomfort, the realization, something still didn't sit right. Because stories like this never really end when we think they do. They end when they stop being useful. And usefulness, in the attention economy, has nothing to do with truth. It has to do with momentum. So let's talk about the quiet after the storm, the part almost no one examines. The weeks after the outrage faded. The time when the headlines disappeared, but the assumptions stayed. Because while the internet moved on, the narrative didn't evaporate. It settled. And settling is far more dangerous than chaos. Chaos is loud. Chaos gets questioned. Chaos eventually burns out. But settled ideas? They harden. They slip into casual conversation. They resurface as context. They become the unspoken background of future stories. You've seen it before. Someone mentions a name, and another person replies, "Yeah. Wasn't there something weird about that?" No details. No sources. Just a vague sense that something happened. That's how reputations erode without anyone ever making a formal accusation. And that's the afterlife of this story. Because even though nothing was proven, the implication became part of the cultural memory. And cultural memory doesn't require evidence. It requires repetition. This is where we have to confront a deeply uncomfortable idea. Sometimes the most harmful stories are the ones that never get resolved. Because resolution forces accountability. Unresolved stories linger. They float. They adapt. They get reshaped by whoever needs them next. In future debates, this rumor might resurface as a throwaway line. In future commentary, it might be framed as old news. In future speculation, it might be referenced as if it were established fact. Not because it was, but because it was never definitively challenged in the public imagination. And that raises a question we don't like to ask. Is silence always the right move? Earlier, silence looked like restraint, protection, containment. But silence also leaves a vacuum. And vacuums don't stay empty. They get filled with whatever fits. This is the paradox public figures face. Speak, and you amplify. Stay quiet, and you allow others to define the story. There is no perfect response, only trade-offs. And in this case, the trade-off was allowing the story to die quietly rather than explode further. That might have been the least damaging option. But least damaging doesn't mean harmless. It means controlled damage. And controlled damage still leaves scars. Let's zoom out even further. Because the real issue isn't whether this rumor was fair or unfair. It's why it felt so believable to so many people. That's the question that matters. Believability doesn't come from evidence alone. It comes from narrative alignment. People believe this story because it fits something they already thought they knew. It didn't challenge their worldview. It confirmed it. That's why corrections, if they ever come, rarely have the same impact as the original claim. Corrections ask people to rethink. Claims ask people to agree. Agreement feels easier, especially when it feels emotionally justified. So what does that say about us? It says we're not just consumers of stories. We're collaborators. Every rumor that spreads does so because it finds willing partners. People who feel validated by believing it. People who feel empowered by sharing it. People who feel righteous by defending it. And that collaboration is what turns individual speculation into collective conviction. This story didn't succeed because it was airtight. It succeeded because it was compatible. Compatible with existing biases. Compatible with existing narratives. Compatible with a culture that rewards outrage and punishes patience. That's the machinery at work. And unless that machinery changes, this won't be the last story like this. Which brings us to something that rarely gets acknowledged. There is a difference between being informed and being involved. You can be aware of a controversy without amplifying it. You can observe a rumor without participating in its spread. You can question a narrative without feeding it. But those distinctions require discipline. And discipline is hard in a system designed to erode it. The platforms we use encourage immediacy. React now. Share now. Comment now. There's no built-in pause button for ethics. That pause has to come from us. And that's why moments like this matter. They reveal the cost of moving too fast. Not just for the people at the center of the story, but for the culture as a whole. Because when we normalize speculation about deeply personal matters, we lower the threshold for what becomes acceptable next time. And next time, the target might not be famous. It might be someone without resources, without legal protection, without a platform to absorb the blow. This is how norms shift. Gradually, quietly, until one day, something that once felt unthinkable feels routine. That's the long shadow of stories like this. Now let's address something many viewers might be thinking. But isn't this just how the internet works? Yes, and that's exactly the problem. Accepting harm as inevitable doesn't make it neutral. It makes it normalized. And normalization is how systems avoid accountability. When we shrug and say, "That's just the internet," we absolve ourselves of responsibility. But the internet isn't a force of nature. It's a reflection of collective behavior, which means it can change, but only if enough people decide to behave differently. That change doesn't start with platforms. It doesn't start with laws. It starts with friction. Moments where engagement feels uncomfortable instead of exciting. This story created that friction. For some, not all, but enough to matter. Enough to pause. Enough to question. Enough to feel that something crossed a line. And that feeling is the seed of change. Because outrage thrives on certainty. Discomfort thrives on doubt. And doubt is where critical thinking lives. So if there's one thing this entire saga accomplished, beyond the noise, beyond the damage, it's this. It exposed how fragile our standards are when emotion is involved. How quickly we abandon skepticism when a story feels satisfying. How easily we confuse access with truth. That realization is unsettling, but it's also empowering. Because once you see the